It is certainly not meant to be an attack. It is a we'll say criticism of Turning Point. I believe it to be a threat to democracy. And I mentioned that the times when people were reading it, so they now read it obviously in the lens of his death, and like they'll probably grant me, oh, it wasn't written before then, but now that you've read it, like I got a bad review on a conservative news website and says my book was stomping on his grave. I'm like, I wrote it like a year before this. So the book is not intended to be any type of an attack, but also it is not a debate book. It's not a theological debate book, and here's their points and here's my points. It is more of a narrative of how they came to be. It's certainly sort of a history book in that regard, but it's not meant to, you decide what they say and what I say sort of thing. It's not meant for kind of a debate society. And I guess lastly, it's not while it has Christian themes in it, it certainly isn't just about Christian themes. It's certainly about a Christian group or claims at Christianity, but many reviewers have noticed that they wanted to read it because of the threat to our non-religious government, to our freedom of church and state.
Everybody, welcome back to Living the Next Chapter, the author podcast. And I get some amazing guests on this show, and we talk about a lot of stuff. I haven't really talked a lot about this, and I'm excited to have Matthew here on the show together. We're going to be talking about his writings, his book, Seven Mountains Mandate. There's a lot here to talk about. And if you've heard of my guests, you already kind of know where we're going. You haven't, hold on, buckle in, because we're going to have a great conversation and learn a lot. And I'm excited to have Matthew on the show. Matthew, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here.
I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. I know you get to talk to a lot of people about a lot of things, and you get to come here with me today. I'm thrilled. So thank you for making time for us. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Excellent. We have authors listening to the show, Matthew, and they are here to learn about writing, and you teach writing, and you've written many things. I'm kind of curious from your perspective, if there was a podcast and a conversation that you could have partaken in as a listener prior to your journey of writing, what kind of things would have been helpful for you to hear back in your early days that maybe somebody today is listening and they're at that starting point right now? What can you do to encourage that author, that writer that's listening?
I mean, you do hear it a lot, but it is great advice is to read as widely as possible, not just fiction or not just particular types of things, but read all types of things, and then try to, in some manners, put in your own words why it's good writing. I remember back in the day, there used to be, I think it was the Atlantic or the New Yorker, they would have a short segment of something from writing, and then somebody would write after that why it was good writing. I mean, why it flowed well, why it sounded well on the screen, and those are always good things to do. So to read widely. But also I think that, I got into journalism because I thought that was the only route. I'm an English professor now, and I tell my students I was not an English major for that very reason. No one thinks English majors get jobs. They do. But I went into journalism because that was the particular thing that I thought was specific enough to get a job. That may not be the case today, but nonetheless, and so I learned how to write a particular genre of news and do a lot of different things there. I think that writing widely in different genres is always important. So if you can get experience doing that, whether it is starting your own thing, this book that I'm going to talk about today started with me doing a blog that had a couple of hundred views a month. So you don't have to have a big platform to do what you do. But also I think that the third thing I would say is, and after reading and doing writing lots of genres is do try to find, they use the word niche. Sometimes that brings up in fiction, the type of stories you write. I mean, write whatever you want to write, but if you think about it in terms of nonfiction, try to write about a topic or an idea that few people are writing about. Because that is often the platform that publishers like to see. They like to see big followers on social media, but also here's something that no one else is doing. So finding your voice, finding your niche, finding your lane, and then trying to do as much on that as possible.
Are you still seeing a desire in your students to write in a world of video and TikToks and things like that, sitting down to write and get words on paper, words on screen.
Yeah,
Are you
I mean,
seeing that?
your stereotypical English major hates AI and wants to do it themselves.
Yeah.
And also they want to, I mean, most of them are into the literature part and reading great literature and trying to write, they're sometimes a graphic novel, sometimes it's, just stuff like that. But they want to expand in terms of what, they can write because they know that writing is important in particular ways. But yeah, they're interested in doing their own thing. But I think also that with English majors, you sort of have to what's the word? Hone them in because they just like to turn in so many pages and it's not all great. So you really have to help them focus on audience.
Okay, now you've picked a topic for the Seven Mountains Mandate that's maybe for some are going to be like, wait, what are we talking about right now? And they're going to decide whether or not to continue listening.
Sure.
The idea that we can talk about things that need to be discussed and put them out there and shine light on truth and all of that, that's really super important. Talk a bit about the reason behind the blog that started the book. Like, how did that begin? And I want to kind of get into the topic of your book because I think this is a super important
Sure.
discussion.
So the topic of the book is about a group called Turning Point USA, which was founded by Charlie Kirk, who was sadly assassinated on September the 10th. And they have many things in which they're into, but one of the first things that they were into was starting a list of professors they didn't like. And I was one of the first people on that list. And I had no idea who they were when they came out with that list in 2016. And I had written an op-ed, an opinion piece for our local paper about not wanting concealed weapons on college campuses. And there's a law in Georgia that allows that now. And I honestly, it was a short opinion piece. I submitted it and didn't get a lot of, commentary. And then months later, Turning Point, in collecting all the things that they wanted to put on this list, found my thing and wrote about it. So I wanted to write about them because they had targeted me and I didn't know who they were and things like that. But also early on, when you start reading about Turning Point, you realize some of the many things they say are not true. So the blog started as each post was debunking Charlie Kirk on blank. And so I chose a particular subject matter, looked at what he'd said on those things and tried to say what he was saying wasn't true. Sometimes it was. So that was a blog I did on Medium, which is, a free blog website. I had several blogs before that on different subject matters. Social media in 2016 obviously was pretty big, but it only allowed a certain amount of characters. So
Yeah.
I wrote a blog a month, had a couple of hundred views. Sometimes it got posted around different people's Reddit trains, and that got some more interest. And then, of course, what I mainly tried to do was write the blog and then post the link to it underneath Charlie and Turning Point social media accounts. So much that eventually they blocked me from doing that. So that's really how to get your stuff out there.
Yeah.
But the blog turned into a couple different articles on very kind of small platforms. And then that turned into some podcasts, being a guest on several podcasts. And then that turned into, having an interest from an acquisitions editor at a publishing house and then moving from there. So it can start small, but I think the reason, and it wasn't necessarily all, step by step doing good, but I do think the reason eventually the book came out is that it was on a subject few people were writing about. I like to talk to community groups and always ask, now, how many of you had heard of Charlie Kirk before he was shot? And maybe a third of the audience would have raised their hand. So this tells me that, that people were not aware of him. And then you add the title of the book, which is sort of this way to practice what is called Christian nationalism, the idea of the Seven Mountains Mandate. That was totally unknown to people. Like the publisher who took this book on was like, and they're a religious publisher. We had no idea what this was. So they wanted to use the unknown factor on the cover and the title. So one reason why we didn't put Charlie or Turning Point on the cover and the title, because few people knew who they were, and we wanted to go with the most unknown factor. So just because you're writing something that is not known doesn't mean that it's not, of interest to people.
So, okay, I'm looking out through the lens of being a Canadian and not being in the mix in the US. So there's a lot of things I don't understand that are going on, which maybe that also is reflective of people from the US and Canada and elsewhere who also don't understand what's going on. So maybe this is a good avenue to kind of go down this conversation. Can you please explain to me, because I don't know what the Seven Mountains Mandate is? Can you kind of give
Yeah,
me an overview?
sure. So I describe it as a strategy of Christian nationalism. Now, that's a big term, and the people who advocate for that don't often use it for themselves, but it means, as the subtitle of the book implies, right, to Christianize your nation, to make your nation into a Christian nation. Now, that does not mean evangelizing people or spreading the gospel or trying to make the majority of people Christians, to identify them as such. It's a minority movement on purpose. So when they say they want to Christianize the nation, they mean culturally, to have a cultural consensus that is Christian and enforce both legal and political and cultural codes through a minority of people that run these cultural institutions. So these seven mountains, and I can talk about the metaphor later, but these are the seven areas of our culture. And the people that advocate for this believe that our culture has been overtaken by demonic forces or satanic forces or anti-Christian forces or forces against the West, against Western civilization, forces that would or have radically changed the culture in your country. And so Christian nationalism is to make your nation a Christian nation by not just law and policy, but the way in which it operates. And so that applies at the federal level, but also applies at the state level, at the local level. So these seven areas are ways in which they not just merely want to influence. And as a Christian, I want to emphasize that it's not just about participating in the public square or arguing for policies and laws on a Christian perspective and trying to convince people to go along with it. This has nothing to do with, in many ways, persuasion. As a professor of rhetoric, I see their attempt to not be rhetorical, to not try to deal with people who are secular or people who are of a different religion. They want to impose in ways that they think they can this Christian idea. So when I say strategy, I mean it's a specific idea of Christian nationalism. There have been some polls and surveys about what tenets of Christian nationalism are, but the main one is you believe that your nation was founded as a Christian nation, and two, it's no longer that because it's been taken away, and three, it should be that in the future. So Seven Mountains Mandate is about retaking the nation through these seven cultural areas. And so, some of them are pretty easy to understand, the government or the mountain of government, electing Christian leaders. So the Speaker of the House right now, Mike Johnson, is an advocate of the Seven Mountains Mandate. And there are other people at both state and federal level that believe in it. So some of them are a bit more vague, or like the Mountain of Family. It is about wanting to enforce or silencing voices that go against traditional ideas of the family. Obviously, definition of marriage,
Right.
limited to male and female, but also very specific gender role. So one example of that is the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. So he's in the federal government. He's appointed by the president, but also he is a Seven Mountains Mandate person, an advocate of this, so much that he is enforcing a particular type of definition of manhood on the Department of Defense.
Right.
So he wants, in some manners, to limit women and not just combat roles, but the roles in which they play by inserting higher physical standards that they have not had to meet before, and imposing a definition of manhood on the males themselves with no beards and physical shapes and things like that.
Yeah.
So it is not just a kind of a culture of minorities screaming and shouting about the ways that we've lost the nation. It is about taking dominion, as they say. So I would suggest for listeners in Canada, this is not just an American issue.
Right.
Or problem. There was a Turning Point Canada there for a while, and they're trying to restart it. There's a Turning Point UK. And if you see anything about the UK, it is about very anti-immigrant feelings, that their country, their culture, their implying white culture has been taken away from them. There's also a Turning Point in Australia. And I just read this week about a Turning Point in Netherlands. So this idea of the Seven Mountains Mandate and taking back our culture, Turning Point USA with Charlie Kirk is the indispensable organization for that. Most people, when they hear of Charlie Kirk, think of him as this college student, campus, underneath the tent debater, and that is certainly what he started out as and what he was doing when he was killed.
Yeah.
But there's an arm of Turning Point for each of these 7 areas. They're a large, sprawling organization that has college student thing, yes, but they also have high school students. But there is an arm of Turning Point for each of these mountains. And they have the money and the staff and the volunteers and the energy now, really, because of his death, to keep on expanding. So this is why I suggested that the Seven Mountains Mandate is an anti-democratic force. They may get elected by democratic means, but once they're in power, they try to use minority rule to enforce these cultural codes. And the last thing I'll say about Turning Point is that they talk about debate and free speech and going on campus, and they just had an event at UC Berkeley this week. And I would suggest that certainly they go on campus and use free speech and the policies there to speak. But what they're really interested in is making content for their own followers to see, look at these crazy people trying to stop us. We're going to go even more fully into our cultural their cultural war victories. That's what they want.
So it's one thing for one group to raise their voice, raise their concerns, get out there, talk about their message. And not everyone's going to agree, obviously.
Right.
We still want that ability to do that, but it needs to have a balance. Is that's where you're heading with this? Like there needs to be equal time in this conversation where it's not just one voice that we're dominating the news and what do you see
I
there?
would say that in a democracy, 2 things are important. One, yes, that all voices are heard. So when you go out and make claims about we shouldn't have these people speak and we should smash other groups and we should not allow them to have roles, and that's what Turning Point says about many groups. That's bad. But then also, I think that in a democracy, it is about, at least the setting of the government, it is about majority rule with minority protections, but often minorities should not overrule the majority.
Right.
And then 2, when I say it's a threat to democracy, it is they don't believe that America is a democracy. They want to call it a republic, and for various reasons, they're not right. But their idea is that the nation should be centered around a particular culture, a Protestant culture.
Yeah.
Think about the separation of church and state in the First Amendment in the United States.
Right.
Obviously, that's been around for a while, and that means, in some manners, the government does not choose favorites when they choose or practice or allow people to practice their religion freely. What Turning Point and their allies say is that the founding fathers did not intend that the freedom of religion only applied to within Protestantism, that the government would not choose between Protestant sects, between Baptists and Methodists, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And clearly that eliminates a lot of other people.
Right.
So when they want a Christian consensus, obviously it eliminates non-Christians and Jews and things like that. But it also primarily wants to have their version of Christianity rule over the rest of us. So that's why I suggest it's anti-democratic. So yes, there's a Turning Point chapter on my campus. There are 3,000, probably more than that, Turning Point chapters around the nation now. They're welcome to show up on my campus and do whatever it is they want within our guidelines. But no, I'm not interested in this kind of balance because I believe they're an anti-democratic force and I'm for democracy. So if I can convince people that they are anti-democratic, then I'm all for that.
Okay. All right. So if Turning Point, for example, and that movement is what you would maybe term as not the majority, then what would you say is the ideal majority from a U.S. perspective that you're looking to protect through the book, through your writing, through your message? Like what's the definition of majority?
I have said that if the Seven Mountains Mandate is a minority movement on purpose, then the only answer to that is a majority movement. And I don't mean that in a partisan way or a big D Democrat. What I mean is a small lettercase Democrat. It means that we should not be ruled over by a minority. And that majority includes broadly ideas of being for democracy, being for religious pluralism, religious freedom as the founders intended. Of course, using the Constitution to give rights to every single person and not have a corrupt administration. But it really means at the state and local level is compromised. And that is exactly what, to me, the founding fathers published. They certainly had big disagreements when they wrote the Constitution. But the Turning Point allies and the people that follow the Seven Mountains Mandate, because they believe they have God on their side and they believe that they're the good and the rest of the people are evil, they're not
Interesting.
willing to compromise with evil.
Yeah.
So they only want it their way and their fashion. And to me, that is not the sign of a healthy democracy.
When I watch the news of the new mayor in New York, the responses to this position of him moving into the mayor now from senior leadership in the US all the way down to people on the street in New York, it's another example of just how divided, I guess, we all are, and finding our path and what we believe to be true. Why are we at this point then? Because I would think that there are other equal minorities who also would love to be able to step up and take your country in a new direction, right? So there's like multiple versions of this, right? So
I think we see this a bit in European countries that have a quite, a little bit different government setup. We have these minority coalitions that have to come together to form a government, and you can snap government and get them out. We don't have that same setup in America, but the idea is because you now have multiple, we'll say, groups and not just two parties or people who are interested in parties and try to work outside the grassroots and all that, you really have to find a way in which to get them to work together. So, to answer your question, right, there's been a really, and the book kind of takes the history of the Seven Mountains Mandate through the 70s, and it can go back before that, but there's been a group that says we don't want to work with anybody else. If you think about Christian nationalism, there was a history of Christianity being outside of politics and refusing to participate in culture. They're called the fundamentalists. And that was alive in the 20s, and they got mocked and all that. And they said, we just want to run our church. We don't want to play a role in society. Well, by the time the 60s comes, more Christians were like, well, our culture is changing rapidly and we don't like that. So part of this list of these 7 areas in 1975, when it was invented, was we want to, Christianize our culture, take back these areas. If you add that to what happened around the turn of the century, they added an element that makes it no compromise, that makes it hard to reason with them. And this is the idea of spiritual warfare, is that the nation is not just a debate society or not just a politically divided society. It is a spiritually divided society that is good and evil. And if, to me, as a professor of rhetoric, what I've seen in my lifetime is just the level of rhetoric being raised so much that every single issue now is good and evil.
Right. Yeah.
We have nationalized local issues, and we have made national politics the only identity that matters. And so from Newt Gingrich and the Republicans, starting their turn in the late 90s through 2000s, with culture war being a term that we now use to now, we've obviously not taken the time to think about ways in which we can work together. Our divisions have just grown. And obviously President Trump is the finest example of that, using divisions to be elected. Right. In terms of the book, I think what it shows is that when that happens, when this division is so high and so at a fever pitch, you don't see these other groups gaining steam or these other groups doing it on the sidelines. And then when they get in power, you're like, how did this happen?
Right.
I grew up in the South, which is obviously a very religious area in our country. And while I was familiar with these ideas in the book, they were kind of fringe, and they were kind of like, oh, these other people outside of mainline Christianity. That is not the case anymore, because more and more we have let the divisions happen. So I think that in terms of your question about the mayor of New York, right? We have these villains that they want to play. Right. Whether we've nationalized a very important local election, but still a very local election. Like, I don't see the need for me to comment on the mayor of New York because I don't live there. Yeah. But we have nationalized particular people to make them villains.
When I hear them asking the president about his thoughts about New York and all that, I'm like, I know he's from New York and blah, 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 but it just seems like that seems an odd question for the leader of a country to talk about a city. I don't we don't see that in Canada.
No, right.
That kind of question.
This is like the King of England talking about the mayor.
One little tiny town.
Yorkshire.
Yeah. It just seems like it's it's finding its way into the conversation more and more and more.
Mhm.
And
Because they want to take every particular piece of ground. And I use that phrase on purpose because Erica Kirk used it a couple of days ago. So they're not just interested in federal elections, they're interested in state elections. Turning Point has a school board watch list, a list of school board members they don't like. They spent last week's election recalling a city council member in Mesa, Arizona, because they didn't like them. So they're interested in all levels of elected office.
left untapped and ready to take and do whatever they want, what's your fear for an organization like that when it comes to democracy in the US?
Um, I mean, I do think they operate from a kind of fear-based thing, not just them afraid of other people. But once you see how big they are and the sprawling organization and the impact they've had so far, a lot of people then will say, "Well, I don't want any part to do with that." Especially people on university and college campuses, they just want to go about their job and not get involved. Because whenever you say something that they don't like or say something that is outrageous and they make it a viral post, right, you get a lot of attention that you should not have to put up with. So they're using social media and using culture war to gain power. And I think that, the question is, I think the main question is what does Turning Point offer now that Charlie Kirk is dead? I think that they're a brand. They're a total conservative brand. They've replaced party organizing in many ways. That is, replaced the Republican Party. So they have so much power that they could obviously get people elected, but that's just one of the seven mountains. So really the danger for me is how they grow in all these other areas. Now, some of these other areas, other groups have tried in the past and not been successful, but Turning Point's been successful at each and every step that they've taken. So, I think that in particular states they would have more power than others, but this idea that at all these areas could be controlled by not just this one group, but this idea that other groups agree upon is frightening because you're obviously reducing religious pluralism, but you're also reducing the ability for other people to participate in a democracy because you had made them so afraid to participate.
You talk about the fever pitch of what's happening right now. It's just going to keep building and building and building like a balloon. At some point, something's got to give.
Hmm.
What's your fear?
You know, I did think that initially with Charlie Kirk's assassination, right? We in America have not seen this particular type of assassination in some decades. Obviously, we've had political violence in recent years and focusing on elected officials or people running for office. But to shoot someone down who was merely at that point talking on a college campus, I did think initially that it would lead to more violence. It took a couple of days for them to arrest someone, and we have little on the motives of that one person. But I think that because we are so divided, I think there are many people that recognize the next match into the fire could be really bad. And so maybe they've stepped back from saying certain things. But yeah, you're right. At some point, you've got to think, what is the cultural response? And so I'm reading about political violence. It has been isolated. And I want to use that word. One person attacking some other people that they don't like or killing them or trying to kill them. The question is when we might move to collective violence, when organized groups might try to take over a city or organize in some manners like the insurrection of January 6th. I mean, if that had been successful, we'd be talking obviously a different story.
Right.
So, does another election year and midterm elections are important, but they're not as important as presidential ones. So when we face that again, we would be facing organized violence if one particular side, the conservative side, doesn't win. And so in terms of Charlie Kirk, his death has been framed as being a martyr. And that to me, and this is why I said many times, I don't think he's a martyr, and I don't think we should use that term because that term is prone to igniting retribution, violence in response. So, whether or not whatever you think about his personal life, the martyrdom rhetoric in other countries has really made it more violent. So, yes, I think we're headed down a very dark road, and there are ways we could get off of it. But I also think that Charlie Kirk's death had been put into the culture war machine, and so the ways in which they're trying to make him into a saint has not really, spread that far outside of his own bubble, which I think is a good sign. Even though we're still divided, it's still, oh, we can still ignore this particular thing.
So there's still room for free speech in that you can write a book like the Seven Mountains Mandate. Someone can get up and talk about their religious beliefs and how they should shape the world. There's a lot of room here for us to still have this. I think the biggest thing that I noticed from a Canadian perspective, watching all that happen with Charlie and everything, is just the fact that if somebody doesn't like you, they can silence you.
Yeah,
physically,
right.
in the
Yeah.
news, whatever, they can just shut you off.
Yeah.
And I fear that pathway would mean that any group, anywhere, could be silenced from any speech that someone else doesn't agree with. Right. So
Yes.
like someone could silence you for your book and say, you shouldn't write this book. It shouldn't be out there. And,
They tried,
we're going to
yeah.
shut you down. Right. They're going to shut you down.
Yeah.
And you talk about being on a list and all of that. Like that's what I'm afraid of, is that where is that free speech part? Like, I don't understand who controls what is free speech then.
Right. So if you think about if the people that don't like you have the power of government institutions,
right,
that is obviously a problem. So we see Trump going on a retribution tour with the people he's indicting, things like that. So the Department of Justice is no longer that. And we see using the power of government, but also the power of cancel culture. And I don't really like that term, but I mean, there was another list made in the days after Charlie Kirk's assassination of comments and social media comments that people didn't like. And many people were fired from their jobs because their post went viral because of groups like Turning Point. Turning Point a week ago tried to get teachers fired from a school in Arizona because they were wearing a shirt that Turning Point thought had something to do with Charlie Kirk's death and had nothing to do with it. And it just went, viral. So they're using the power of government and the power of culture. And so when you own both, when in this case the Republican conservative side owns both of those things or can use both of those things, yes, it is not free speech. It's speech that comes with tremendous cost, and some people just choose not to participate. But it's not just about speech. It is about intimidation. So again, Turning Point had an event at UC Berkeley on Monday, and there was a large amount of protests, and there were some physical assaults, and that should never happen, and people were arrested for it. And I say Antifa protesters were arrested. But Turning Point itself, I write about in a chapter, determined that they were the people that should go after people that talk online with kids. So they started a conversation with a person in Nebraska posing as a young girl and kept trying to contact him and talk him into meeting at a Walmart in Nebraska. And then they went there and ambushed him with a camera. And they did that because they thought that's their job, not merely law enforcement. And then they recorded it and then put it out on Turning Point Media. And so it's not just about debating positions. They're actively trying to be a cultural law enforcement.
That seems like overreach to me as I hear you explain that.
It didn't go well for them, so they haven't done it since. But the idea was there, and so much that they tried to do it. Yeah.
So for someone who doesn't see the world through your lens, Matthew, when they pick up a copy of your book, and I'm encouraging them to do that because it's always good to hear someone else's point of view and get perspective. For someone who might not be your target audience for your book, talk to them for a second. The value for them as a reader. How should they approach this book? What's in it for them? What is your hope? Like, what's your desire for someone who is on the fringe of what you're talking about, but they need to hear the message?
I see that audience as someone who's kind of aware of Charlie Kirk and might listen to several of his things or see him on Fox News a lot and kind of, it was terrible that he was killed and we should allow more people to speak on campus. That's all true. So if that's the audience, then if you're just thinking of Charlie Kirk as this conservative college person, then you're missing this bigger picture. So here's the bigger picture in my book. But also, I think not just politically a different audience, but an audience that needs to be aware that their family members could be into this and not have told you. I've gotten many a story so far of readers who say, "I've read your book, it scares me," and then I found out that my son or my nephew, and it's usually a male, called me on the day that Charlie was shot and said they shot him, and they were like, "Who was shot?" And they explained to them that was the first time they had ever talked about Charlie. So if that's the audience, that you have a family member that is into this and you want to know more about it, and it's difficult to talk with them about it, this is a great book for that. So you might necessarily not agree with me politically or socially, but if you want more information about what your family members are not talking about, that could be that. And I say, thirdly, I've had several people talk about the book came out on the 30th, but it was in people's mailboxes early September. And so some of them started to read it according to reviews they've written online, as also they saw the Charlie Kirk assassination, and it was very strange for them to read the book and to see that.
Right.
And so I want to make sure people understand who he was, and it is not just a negative book about him. It lays out many things that he said, but he was very successful at this organization that he built, and you can see the history of that in the book. So if you're interested in that, interested in a guy who didn't go to college, was very successful, a guy who was a kingmaker politically, but also a husband and a father, had a radio show. So if you want more information about how that could happen, then you should read the book.
Okay. What is this book not meant to be?
It is certainly not meant to be an attack. It is we'll say, criticism of Turning Point. I believe it to be a threat to democracy. And I mentioned that the times when people were reading it, so they now read it obviously in the lens of his death, and like,
right,
they'll probably grant me, oh, it wasn't written before then, but now that you've read it, like I got a bad review on a conservative news website and says my book was stomping on his grave. I'm like, I wrote it like a year before this. So the book is not intended to be any type of an attack, but also it is not a debate book. It's not a theological debate book, and here's their points and here's my points. It is more of a narrative of how they came to be. It's sort of a history book in that regard, but it's not meant to, you decide what they say and what I say sort of thing. And it's not meant for kind of a debate society. And I guess lastly, it's not. While it has Christian themes in it, it certainly isn't just about Christian themes. It's certainly about a Christian group or claims at Christianity, but many reviewers have noticed, that they wanted to read it because of the threat to our non-religious government, to our freedom of church and state.
It's fascinating, Matthew. It's very fascinating. I'm glad, like you said, you went through my list of episodes and you're like, I don't see anybody talking about stuff like this on your podcast. I'm like, exactly. I've been waiting for you. So it's exciting to have you here. There's more books from you as well that people can fall in love with. As far as people connecting with you about the book, maybe there's people listening, they're like, I want to get Matthew on my show, whatever. Where's a good place to send our listeners, Matthew?
I'm on social media, X, Twitter at Matthew Boedy, MattheWhewBoedy. I'm also on Blue Sky at that. And I have a website, is it comma.org? I never remember, but you can contact me through that.
Okay.
And some people have found my, university website email address and has sent me some disgruntled reader emails. So you're welcome to find that and use it. But I'm on social media if you want to contact.
Excellent. Matthew, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for making time for this. Keep serving your students, keep showing up, keep writing, keep sharing your message. I think we need this. We need this back and forth and try to find a healthy spot where we can.
Yeah, I did want to mention in terms of the writing of the book. So I mentioned before how I got the acquisition editor to call me, but after that, getting the agent and having the agent sell the book, we were rejected by every single publisher that she went to, and she went to a lot.
Wow.
And it came down to, she kind of gave me the conversation, well, you could publish this yourself. And then a week later, we got the Westminster John Knox Press. So rejections are going to happen, even with a highly great book like this, but again, expect that. Yeah.
And don't give up. Share your message, get your voice out there. Matthew, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
Oh, happy to do it.
Excellent. Everyone, all information, as always, in the show notes. you love great guests like this, keep listening to the show. Reach out to Matthew. I know he'd love to hear from you. Seven Mountains Mandate. Again, Matthew, thank you so much. Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. Glad to have you here. I just want to let you know that you can always find out what we're doing live in the moment by going to our YouTube channel. Head over to livingthenextchapter.com. There'll be a link right there. Head over to our YouTube channel. Make sure you like, subscribe, do all the things that all the YouTubers love to say. And in our YouTube channel, a couple things. You're going to get advanced listens. You're going to get the episodes that we're working on in real time. So we record and post daily on our YouTube channel. I'd love for you to give us a follow over there. As well, we're making playlists. We have over 500 episodes. So finding the right episode for you, we're trying to group things into playlists. So if you like children's books, if you like business, you like historical fiction, we're grouping our authors together to make it a little easier for you to find your favorite next author. So head over to livingthenextchapter.com. And again, I'd love to hear from you. Hearing from the listeners of the show is great. And I just want to say thank you for being a part of the podcast family. And I look forward to having you back for the next episode. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate your time and your listen. Take care.